Hello, everyone. My name is Raeesa Farooqi, and I'm the Business Development and Outreach Coordinator with the Alberta Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar entitled Responding to Online Hate During COVID-19. So next slide, please. AAISA is the umbrella organization for immigrant serving agencies in Alberta, and we're excited to be offering this webinar today as part of a larger series of professional development offerings centered around anti-discrimination. This series is being offered in collaboration with ActionDignity, ARDN, and AMSSA. We would also like to acknowledge our funder, the Human Rights, Education, and Multiculturalism Fund. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to view at a later date on AAISA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via aisa.ca. Now, I'm going to pass it off to Sabrina Dimitra from AMSSA to go through a quick tech session for today's webinar.
Thank you, Raeesa. And for any technical difficulties that you may experience during today's webinar, please feel free to contact my colleague Melissa Jayde, AMSSA's Communication Operations Manager, by either emailing Melissa at mj@amssa.org, or you can also give Melissa a phone call at 604-718-4221. And on the next slide, I'd like just to talk a little bit about the webinar platform. So on the right-hand side of the webinar platform, you will find a control panel that can be expanded and collapsed by clicking on the orange arrow, which looks similar to the image posted on this slide. As well, on the next slide, you'll see that it's also possible to expand the features within the control panel by either clicking on the little plus sign symbol or little arrow symbol next to each title. You'll either see a plus or an arrow sign symbol depending on which browser you're using. So it's possible to click on that little plus or arrow symbol to expand the feature so that you're able to fully utilize the control panel. And so there's also, on the next slide, there's a way how you can listen to today's audio. You can do that either using your telephone or your mic and speakers, and you can control that by expanding the audio function within the webinar control panel by clicking on that little tab. And so if you just select to access the webinar audio via the telephone today, please note that long distance charges may apply depending on your phone plan. And lastly, on the next slide, I just wanted to mention how you can submit questions during today's webinar. So on that control panel, there's also a question feature box, and you can expand that one and look to enter your questions, and they will be shared with our speakers later today. And so I'd like to encourage everyone to submit their questions continuously throughout the presentation so that our speakers can collect and be able to respond to those at the end of the webinar today. So now I'd like to hand it over to Raeesa Farooqi to continue introducing the content for today's webinar.
Thanks, Sabrina. As you may know, AAISA offers Canada's only certification program for qualified settlement practitioners. So if you attend or view the recordings of all 3 webinars in this series, this will qualify as training hour credit towards AAISA certification. Please note that this is only open to settlement practitioners or those training to become one, but it is open to anyone across the country, not just Alberta. For those who are interested in obtaining training hour credits for these 3 webinars, you must apply for them by completing a quiz. Please email pd@aisa.ca for more info about that. Additionally, there will be a full-day anti-discrimination course that will be offered later this year, and that will also qualify for credit. Details about that will be posted on aisa.ca once available. So if we can go to the next slide, I can introduce our facilitators for today's webinar. So Tyra Erskine is the program coordinator for the People's Coalition to Advance Fairness and Equity at ActionDignity. She has a BA in political science, and her field of focus is anti-racism. She's an experienced anti-racism facilitator and has hosted trainings at SAIT, Gen YYC, the CCE, Camp Firefly, Calgary Pride, and the Calgary Women's March. She is also a member of Community Wise's anti-racist organizational change project, and authored their anti-racism training manual. Jayde Roche is the program manager for rural immigration with the Alberta Rural Development Network, a new initiative formed to help support newcomers in rural communities while enhancing the capacity of local community-based organizations through research and learning. Currently, she's working on her Master of Arts in Community Engagement. So without further ado, Tyra and Jayde.
Thank you, Sabrina and Raeesa, and welcome everyone to the Online Hate and COVID-19 webinar. We would also like to take this time to introduce both our organizations. So as Raeesa mentioned, my name is Jayde and I work for the ARDN. So the Alberta Rural Development Network is a nonprofit organization that uses the combined expertise of 9 Albertan post-secondary institutions to support rural development in Alberta and help rural communities grow through research and learning. I would also like to take this time to acknowledge the contributions of our colleague Elnaz to this webinar and the larger anti-discrimination project. Elnaz is a project coordinator with the ARDN and has a passion for design and socially sustainable communities. I will now let my colleague Tyra introduce ActionDignity.
Thanks, Jayde. So I'm Tyra, and I work at ActionDignity. And ActionDignity is a community-based organization that facilitates the collective voice of Calgary's ethnocultural communities towards full civic participation and integration through collaborative action. ActionDignity embraces and promotes the following values: respect for diversity, equity and social justice, active citizenship and democratic participation, and collaboration.
So today's presentation is the second in a series of webinars and workshops on anti-discrimination topics. Before we get started, we'd like to begin with our territorial acknowledgement. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories you reside on, and a way of honoring the First Nations people who have been living and working on the land for time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. The languages, cultures, traditions, civil laws of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit precede colonization. I would like to take this moment to recognize that I am on Treaty 6 territory, home to the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Saulteaux.
And I would like to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 7, which is the territory of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. Mohkinstsis, named by the Blackfoot where the Bow River meets the Elbow, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
We would like to encourage everyone to take a moment to acknowledge where they are. Reflect on where you are located. Is it part of the numbered treaties? Whose land are you on? Now we would like to cover the objectives of this webinar. By the end of the webinar today, our hope is that participants will develop an understanding of online hate during COVID-19, recognize the implications and impacts of online hate, become familiarized with actions that you can take online to challenge racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19, and finally, learn how to incorporate boundaries into online spaces. I would like to mention that we will be building on our research and analysis from our previous webinar titled COVID-19 and Racism that was hosted on April 15th. If you are interested in viewing this webinar, you can do so on the AAISA YouTube page as was previously mentioned. All right, and now for our outline. So Over the next 2 hours, we will begin with our online contact and accountable spaces brief. We'll then provide you with a recap of our last webinar, including some key terms and updates since our last analysis on racism and COVID-19. We will then share with you our first poll. Next, we will move into an analysis of online hate during the pandemic and end that section with our second poll. We will then share tips and suggestions on how to respond to online hate, as well as some resources that you can access for further learning. We will then have our final closing poll and wrap things up with a self-care activity before opening it up to questions. So as was mentioned, you can ask questions at any time during this webinar and we'll answer them at the end. Now I will hand things off to Tyra to go over the accountable spaces brief.
Thank you, Jayde. So before we begin, it's important to go through our accountable spaces guidelines. So these have been adapted from CommunityWise, and the link to this guide can be found in the references section at the end of this presentation. And these accountable spaces guidelines are not only just for today's webinar, but are also good practices when engaging in discussions on difficult topics such as racism and discrimination. And they can be used as a tool to keep ourselves mindful and engaged. So first, I want to begin by acknowledging that everyone is in their own space today, and we encourage you to do what you can in the space to make sure that you're comfortable. So number one is to respect the space and others. So since we are doing this virtually, please try and acknowledge the ways that you can make this space accountable for you and plan any actions that you might need to take to make sure that you are comfortable. And we also understand that individuals experience racism in different ways, and it is important to recognize that each viewpoint and experience is valid, even if they differ, and validate experiences rather than lecturing or giving advice. And consider that you don't need to agree with the perspective in order to understand it. And three, examine your own privilege and be of potential power dynamics that you might contribute to within the space. And also be aware of assumptions you might make about other people. Number four, recognize that we are all in a place of learning and be open to calling in harmful attitudes, as well as open to critical self-reflection. When possible, try to call people in instead of calling them out. And number five, take care of yourself. Try and incorporate boundaries and preparation into your online experience and have a self-care plan ready and be ready to contact a person that you can debrief with. So these accountable spaces are both for this session, but also can be utilized in any interactions that you have online. And now I would like to give a content warning. So a content warning is used to warn attendees of upcoming information that they might find triggering or upsetting. And the content warning for this webinar is 1, discussion of COVID-19. So this content will include information on COVID-19 outbreaks, illness, and death. And this content is related to anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Black racism, as well as incarceration. And the second trigger warning is specifically for anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, because the content will include specific examples of racism, xenophobia, and hate. And now, before we get into the new content, I want to give a recap of the last webinar, Racism and COVID-19. And in that webinar, we covered 1, a background on COVID-19. So to reiterate, coronaviruses are a large family of viruses, and COVID-19 is a new disease that has not been previously identified in humans. So please visit the Health Canada website for the most up-to-date and accurate information on the COVID-19. Currently, there are 52,000 cases of COVID-19 in Canada, and this data is as of yesterday, and compared to just over 26,000 cases that we reported in the last webinar. And currently, some provinces are working on lifting some restrictions. So New Brunswick has already loosened some of its restrictions, and the first phase of Saskatchewan's reopening will begin May 4th, while provinces including Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, as of yesterday, have announced reopening plans that are in the works. And in the last webinar, we also covered the connection between racism and health. In this section, we focused on our discussion of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, anti-Black racism and xenophobia, anti-Indigenous racism, and incarceration and the carceral state in Canada. And then finally, we looked at self-care and community care during COVID-19. And in this section, we discussed some of the mental health concerns and impacts of this during the COVID-19 pandemic. We shared some tools and resources that people can access during this time, such as the ActionDignity resource package. And now I would like to go over a few updates that we've had since the last webinar. So related to COVID-19 and incarceration, as of April 27, there have been 249 positive tests in federal institutions, and of those, 105 are at Mission Institution in BC. So this is the largest COVID-19 outbreak in a Canadian federal institution. And on May 15th, an inmate at Mission Institution died from COVID-19. And I also want to note that in the survey that we had sent out after the last webinar, one participant reported that they had seen someone writing, or they had seen someone write, incarcerated people deserve to catch COVID-19. And another update since the last webinar has been the large COVID-19 outbreak at the cargo meat plant in High River, Alberta. There was also an outbreak at the JBS plant in Brooks, Alberta. There has been at least one death at cargo and also another death at the JBS plant. And within this situation, it's really important to mention that 70% of the workers at cargo are Filipino. And this is a direct connection between racism and health, both because of the way the outbreak was not prevented, and also how the workers have been treated as a result of the outbreak. In an article posted on April 19th, some employees of cargo told CBC News they are now frightened to come to work, citing elbow-to-elbow working conditions and fears of transmission in a facility they say is simply too crowded, even with reduced personnel, to make physical distancing possible. And as a result of this, workers at cargo and the Filipino community in general are being viewed as carriers of the virus rather than as human beings. And it isn't the fault of Cargill workers for getting COVID-19, but rather it is the fault of the province, the country, and Cargill for not protecting them. I also want to mention that on Monday, ActionDignity and other community members are planning a celebration of life to honor the Cargill employee who died after testing positive for COVID-19. So some other updates that we have are in Indigenous communities, the outbreak of cargo has also spread to Stoney Nakoda Nation, with there being 15 reported cases there. And as of April 24th, there have been 95 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in First Nations communities on reserve and 14 cases in Nunavut Inuit communities. And the next update is on global anti-Black racism. So Africans are still being forcibly detained in South China. The situation is still being widely overlooked. And Hua Qinyang, the director of China's Foreign Ministry Information Department, said on Twitter that the US Department of State is, quote, lying. During the pandemic, African friends, especially students, have been taken good care of in China. 3,000 African students remain safe and sound in Wuhan. And that China-African friendships will never be shaken by wedge driving attempt. And so the response that is given here is to argue that the accusations being given are a lie. And another update that I want to mention is that in addition to the United States, according to the NHS, Black Brits are also being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Black British people are dying at double the rates of white British people. Per 100,000 deaths, there are 23 for white British and 43 for Black British. And even with this, Caribbean people are being more heavily impacted. Per 100,000 deaths, there are 70 for Caribbeans. And I know that this information is very heavy, and there are a lot of updates since the last webinar. So before we move on, I want to take a moment of silence for everyone that has been affected by COVID-19. So thank you everyone for taking that moment. I think it's really important to honor people and also to ground ourselves in the reality of what is going on. So now moving on, I would like to mention some of the feedback that we received from the survey that we sent out. So these are related to specific actions that people would like to see. So some of these are tips on how to help as a bystander, for there to be the creation of an action network, more awareness and education, people calling perpetrators out, having more data related to COVID-19 being collected, and addressing the root causes of racism and oppression, as well as more anti-racism analysis of COVID-19. And here are some of the suggestions that we got from the evaluation that AAISA sent out. So more time spent on strategies and actions, more Canadian data, and spend time on new information specific to COVID-19, and a suggestion to use a wider definition of discrimination. So we've tried to incorporate all of these into this webinar. So thank you for giving your feedback and helping us to adapt the content as needed. So now I'm going to start with a recap of terms. So racism is an individual action or institutional practice backed by institutional power, which subordinates people based on their color or ethnicity. And racialization is the process through which groups come to be socially constructed as races based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, language, economics, religions, culture, policies, or etc. So that is treated outside of the norm and receiving unequal treatment based upon phenotypical features. And so continuing to the next definitions, xenophobia describes attitudes, prejudices, and behavior that reject, exclude, and often vilify persons based on the perception that they are outsiders or foreigners to the community, society, or national identity. And discrimination is the denial of equal treatment and opportunity to individuals or groups because of personal characteristics and membership in specific groups with respect to education, accommodation, healthcare, employment, access to services, goods, and facilities. This behavior results from distinguishing people on the basis without regard to individual merit, resulting in unequal outcomes for persons who are perceived as different. Differential treatment that may occur on the basis of any of the protected grounds enumerated in human rights law. And so now we are going to move into our first poll. So the question that should be on your screen is, how have you been emotionally impacted by COVID-19? So looking at the results, it looks like the majority of people have been managing emotional stress through habits and practices. So 53% said that. And then the second most common response was feeling overwhelmed. Feeling emotionally overwhelmed or drained. So it's good to know that the majority of respondents have been able to manage this in some sort of way. And so now we'll move on to the next question. And so this question is, did you attend or watch the COVID-19 and racism webinar? So looking at the results, it seems like the majority of people didn't watch the COVID-19 and racism webinar. So 44% said no, 32% said yes, and 24% said there was another webinar. So after this one, I encourage you to check that one out if you haven't already, which most of you haven't. So thank you everyone for participating in those polls. So now I want to pass this over to Jayde, who will be covering the analysis of online hate during COVID-19.
Thanks, Tyra. So again, to get started, we are going to begin by introducing some new terms relevant to this topic and to help guide and inform our discussion today. So the first term I'd like to discuss is online hate. This definition we have chosen comes from an article titled Associations Between Bystanders and Perpetrators of Online Hate. So the definition reads, online hate involves actions involving the denigration, harassment, exclusion, and advocacy of violence against specific groups on the basis of assigned or selected characteristics. Examples of this may include place of origin, race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. And this is done through information and communication technologies. So an example of online hate could be an image that calls for or glorifies violence towards a particular group. And again, this broadly describes activities happening online, and online hate might not present itself as overt hate speech, as I'll cover in the next definition. So hate speech can be understood as any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or group on the basis of who they are. So in this definition of hate speech, it's important to consider that this can take place online or offline. And the definition that we've chosen to use comes from the UN Strategy and Plan on Hate Speech. So next, I'm going to move into covering the concept of cultures of hatred. So this is defined as communities in which racism, misogyny, and other prejudices are normalized. So this is referenced to a definition provided on the website MediaSmarts. Examples of cultures of hatred may include online gaming communities where hateful language is normalized. Cultures of hatred can be especially dangerous when people are exposed to these kinds of prejudiced views. And MediaSmarts also notes that although young people may not participate in this prejudiced speech, they often cannot help but find their own views and opinions influenced by the values of the communities that they are a part of. So this is something else to consider as we begin our analysis of online hate, and encourage you to critically reflect on some of these concepts and terms that we have shared. So now I would like to share some data and statistics related to online hate. For this, I'm going to focus on a survey that was conducted in 2018 for the Association of Canadian Studies, published in the Montreal Gazette. So in this survey, they found that in total, about 60% of Canadians that were surveyed reported seeing hate speech on social media. Additionally, young people were most likely to see online hate, with 81% saying that they do so often or sometimes. And finally, nationally, it was reported that 25% of respondents said that hate speech they had seen was directed towards immigrants. Although this survey was conducted before the COVID-19 pandemic, we found these numbers extremely alarming, and also provides us with some context on the rise of online hate in Canada. I've also shared a quote below which reads, but here's the thing, extremists are indoors right now, and just like everybody else. So most of the activity is online, and there has been a wave of virus-related hate on encrypted platforms and on Zoom and across social media. So this quote comes from an interview with NPR's Hannah Alam. Alam also goes on to discuss some of the risks with online hate and radicalization during the pandemic, and drawing special attention to how young people may be impacted at this time. I think this quote really highlights some of the dangers and risks associated with online hate at this time, and also the need to be aware of this increase and exposure to virus-related hate across multiple platforms. And so now I'm going to share with you some results from a survey that was released at our last webinar on racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19. So as with our previous webinar, our presentation today has largely been informed by the concerns raised through this survey and through various other engagements. So the purpose of this survey is to get a better understanding of how COVID-19 related racism and xenophobia has been affecting people in Canada. So some examples of instances of racism and xenophobia that respondents identified were hate posters, a customer refusing to be served by an Asian server, Asian Canadians being asked to leave stores, and one person noted that it was hard to answer the survey because they had seen or experienced more than one instance of racism or xenophobia. So the survey is currently open, and currently we have 58 responses, and a link will be shared with you after the presentation. And again, this information is quite valuable in better understanding these instances of racism and xenophobia that are happening. And to follow up on the survey, I'm going to share a few other key insights that we had received. So 83% of respondents reported having seen, heard, or experienced racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19. The most common location where people witnessed or experienced this was online at 31%. And the second most common location was in grocery stores. And finally, the most common type of harassment was verbal harassment, which was 38% of respondents. And the second most common type was online harassment. Again, these numbers are shared to help give you a sense of what people are saying around this issue. And as well, I think it is concerning that the most common location was online, and again, highlights that need to better understand online hate within this context. So how do we recognize online hate and hate speech? This can often seem like a very difficult task, but we have provided some guiding questions from other trusted sources to help you reflect on if what you have encountered is online hate or hate speech. So the first question is asking yourself if it refers to a specific group of people or if it's a generalized insult. Can it be potentially used with malicious intent? And does it incite hostility, promote hate, or seek to exclude people based on their group membership? These questions are just meant to help guide you and to start thinking critically about some of the content that you are seeing online. If you believe what you have encountered is online hate or hate speech, you might want to consider what actions to take before responding. We'll be going over this a little bit later in the presentation. Next, I'm going to introduce two final terms related to this discussion, and this is hate incidents, and hate crimes. So the differences are important to consider when you encounter online hate or hate speech. A hate incident is a non-criminal act that could affect the sense of safety of a person or an identifiable group of people, and that, given the context, is perceived as such by reason of race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, sexual orientation, etc. So examples of this may include intimidation against identifiable groups or individuals. And on the right, we have a hate crime. So a hate crime is a criminal offense committed which is motivated in whole or in part by the suspect's hate, bias, or prejudice towards an identifiable group. So it's also important to note that hate speech is a crime in Canada. The Criminal Code of Canada states under Section 319 that everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, including online, that incites hatred against identifiable groups, where such is likely to lead to a breach of the peace, is guilty of an indictable or punishable offense. So to be prosecuted as a crime, the speech must be public, deliberate, severe, targeted at an identifiable group, and hateful in its context. So some examples of a hate crime may include violence, threats of violence, or distribution of hate literature or hate mail. For more information on hate speech and Canadian law, we suggest you visit some of the resources we'll be sharing at the end of this presentation for further exploration. So now we're going to be moving into some examples of anti-Asian racism online and online hate. So I would like to just warn everyone that we will be sharing images in the next slide that deal with tweets, that involve anti-Asian racism. All right, so here are two examples that we have decided to share in this presentation. Additionally, I would like to start by stating that in an article released by The Star on April 27th, a recent survey found that 1 in 5 Canadians asked in a poll taken in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal didn't think that it was safe to sit beside an Asian person on the bus at all, and 24% of respondents said that they were uncertain about the idea. And this is according to a poll conducted by the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. We found these survey results deeply concerning and considered these results when looking at the spread of anti-Asian racism online as well. In addition, the US Anti-Defamation League has also been tracking racist memes and online activity directed towards Asian communities in reaction to the outbreak. So they've uncovered cartoons depicting various references mocking bat soup and more violent imagery in relation to the outbreak. So again, here are two examples that we have uncovered. On the left is a tweet referencing the Chinese lab as the source of the outbreak. And on the right, the Lululemon art director had posted a shirt for sale with the words on it, bat fried rice, in relation to the pandemic. And this was shared widely through images and tweets. In our research, we have also discovered online hate, especially images and memes that propagate anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and anti-immigration sentiments. And again, this is in addition to the widespread anti-Asian racism related to COVID-19 happening online. We have chosen not to include these other images in the slides because many of them are deeply upsetting and often graphic images, as well as containing hatefulness and vulgarity in the language used. So this was in part what influenced our decision not to include them. And so we wanted to ensure that we are providing you with some examples to raise awareness on instances of this happening on the internet. I would also like to mention that online hate that we are witnessing during this time is not just in the form of tweets or images, memes. In one video posted on the popular video sharing app TikTok, a young Asian woman mentions that she has recently gone on Omegle, which is an online chat service that essentially connects individuals with strangers. So at the beginning of this short video, she states that many people have been racist towards her. And so she had decided to record some of these people's comments, many of whom made reference that she brought the virus, and one individual even threatened her with extreme violence. Additionally, some websites such as 9gag, a social media website, has threads dedicated towards COVID-19 related content. Much of this contains discriminatory and racist language in addition to hateful images. I will now pass things over to Tyra to talk more about who is targeted by online hate.
Thanks, Jayde. So I'm going to talk about who is being targeted by online hate. So the above is an image by Lisa Wolverum Schablom, who is a Korean-Swedish artist. And the image says, "I am not a virus." So since the pandemic has resulted in most activities occurring online, then that means that hate will also continue to occur online, and that racism and xenophobia related to the COVID-19 will likely increase. And because of the international nature of social media, hate can be coming from anywhere, and this can make it more frequent. So I want to mention a report by Media Arts in 2019. So this was titled "Young Canadians Pushing Back Against Hate Online." And according to their research, most Canadian youth have seen casual prejudice at least sometimes on the online platforms they use. So 4 in 10 on Twitter and YouTube, 5 in 10 on Instagram and Snapchat, and over 6 in 10 on Facebook. While 1/3 of youth who use Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube say they witness casual prejudice often or very often. And not a single youth participant indicated that they had never witnessed casual prejudice on Facebook. And about 1/4 of youth who have witnessed casual prejudice on the top 5 platforms they use say that they do something about it often or very often, while about 1/2 of youth say that they have never engaged in casual prejudice. 1 in 10 admit to engaging in casual prejudice often.
So we know that young people are most likely to see hate online. Again, as I had mentioned in a previous survey, 81% say that they see hate online often or sometimes. So we also wanted to take this time to share some specific resources for youth. So these images are from the Race Issues comic series. And this was created in partnership between the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation and ActionDignity's Youth Place project. The comics were conceptualized by the youth, and then a graphic designer drew them out. The comics show the experience of racialized and Indigenous youth and the ways in which they're being treated both in person and online. So these comics are available to order, and for that we have shared contact information at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide, and it will also be provided to you in our follow-up email. So these can be great resources to raise awareness on this issue. And in addition, I also wanted to share 2 websites as resources for youth and parents when talking about online hate and hate speech. So the first is from Kids Help Phone. So they have a page titled "Helping Young People Recognize and Respond to Online Hate." And so in this resource, they cover some basic information and facts about online hate, what are some common themes found in online hate, and how you can help young people in your life deal with online hate. And the other is a resource from Media Smarts. And so they have an online hate module that's dedicated to addressing this issue and talking about it with youth. And the coverage of it is quite comprehensive. So they have an introduction to online hate, looking at online hate and free speech, as well as online hate and Canadian law. They also look at the impacts of online hate and deconstructing online hate as well. I'll now hand things back to Tyra to go over some more examples.
Thanks, Jayde. So I want to mention another way that people are being targeted online. So this is through a new phenomenon called Zoom bombing. So Zoom bombing is the act of performing a silly or mischievous act in the background of someone's video conference. And in an article by Now Toronto, they talk about some recent examples of Zoom bombing. So they say that Zoom bombing has become a common sight over the past few weeks as schools, meetings, parties, and pub nights shift online, and trolls are finding Zoom invite codes or otherwise searching for open meetings and infiltrating. But just calling it an act of mischief isn't accurate. In many cases, this is targeted hate, and more often than not, it is aimed at marginalized people. So some examples of recent Zoom bombing attacks are, in one case, an African-American man was defending his doctoral dissertation, and this was about the struggles of African-Americans in California's education system. And a participant began sharing profanity on the screen and also started writing out the N-word while he was presenting. And in another case, an Asian woman was leading a cooking tutorial through Zoom, and then a number of new participants entered the stream and began to spew anti-Asian remarks. And then in a 250 guest virtual town hall held by YWCA Canada to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on women, this was infiltrated by people shouting the N-word and also making violent comments to the YWCA staff. And then also in a virtual award ceremony for the Society for Public Health Education, infiltrators started shouting graphic threats of violence. So as Jayde mentioned earlier, the movement towards everything towards the online realm has made community events, meetings, and presentations easy ways to spread hate. And if an extremist and hateful group gets a Zoom or meeting link, they can easily post that into a forum or other places that they congregate and create a coordinated and hateful attack. So I think that this is something we need to be prepared for. We also have to make sure that we have responses ready and that we know how to create boundaries in online spaces. It is something that I recommend you or your organization or group should look into to make sure that you aren't at risk for this type of hateful attack. So now I want to go over some of the different roles in online hate. So first, there is the perpetrator. So I put the perpetrator at the center because the incident and impact is as a result of their actions. They may share a meme, for example, or make a racist post. And as a result of that action, there is an impact. And then there's the individual victim or the community that is impacted. So if the perpetrator sends someone a direct message, then that individual will be directly impacted. But if the incident occurs on a more public setting, then anyone who sees that post that is from the group being targeted will be impacted by it. And another role is that of the bystander. So the bystander in this scenario can also be impacted emotionally by the situation. And there are a couple of different directions that this can take. One is the bystander feeling empathy towards the victim. Two is the bystander feeling empathy towards the perpetrator. And three is the bystander not being emotionally impacted by the situation at all. And there can be many different impacts of this. So at the individual level, the victim can feel fear. Sorry. The individual can feel fear, isolation, individual harm, mental health impacts, fear of recurrence, and fear of violence. Whereas for the bystander, the impact can be that they become normalized to hate. And if they see it all the time, they might not understand the significance, or they can stop responding to it because they don't even notice it anymore. Whereas for the perpetrator, they can become radicalized if they're able to act without consequence. And at the community level, the victims can feel othering. They can feel the impacts of a single incident on the whole community. And family, friends, and community members can be afraid that they might have incidents directed at them as well. And for bystanders, there can be a lot of bystanders that become used to hate and who won't act when they see it. And for the perpetrators, incidents can lead to groups becoming emboldened and connecting with each other. So this can be clear in online forums that are dedicated to hate on sites such as Reddit, 4chan, Discord, and other sites where members of extremist groups are finding community and encouraging each other's hate. And at the society level, racism and xenophobia can exist on a large scale, and this can impact policies, health outcomes, and more. And so this was highlighted in the updates and can also be seen in the way that the media has been portraying COVID-19. And another impact of this has to do with how long it stays visible. So according to Andre Abele, CEO of the Online Hate Prevention Institute, says, the longer the content stays available, the more damage it can inflict on the victims and empower the perpetrators. If you remove the content at an early stage, you can limit the exposure. This is just like cleaning litter. It doesn't stop people from littering, but if you do not take care of the problem, it just piles up and further exacerbates. So this is the importance of responding early, and especially through an online medium, because hate can spread so quickly and it can reach so many people. So now we're going to move into the more practical section. So here we will be covering how to respond to online hate. So first off, I want to talk about a provincial response model that me and other members of the CCE have been creating. So this is through the Coalitions Creating Equity, which is a coalition of 5 municipalities across Alberta who work together to collaboratively address issues of racism, discrimination, and inequity across Alberta. So the municipalities and project holders are, in Calgary, it's ActionDignity. In Lethbridge, it's 5th on 5th Youth Services. In Edmonton, it's Reach Edmonton. And in Wood Buffalo, it's the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo. And in Red Deer, it is the City of Red Deer Welcoming and Inclusion Committee. The project is funded by the Alberta Human Rights Education and Multiculturalism Fund. And one of the outcomes of this project is the creation of an Alberta-wide process for responding to hate incidents. The response model is being developed and has been informed by both a provincial-wide survey and also regional focus groups. This model will include a series of recommended actions that people can take based on the answers that they have to certain questions, and also the type of resolution that they want to receive. So here is some of the information that was gathered during the outreach. So please note that this information was collected prior to the pandemic. And so according to the survey, the most common locations for hate incidences were 1, on the street, 2, in a business, and 3, at work. And another important finding was that the majority of people that responded did not report the incident. 67% of respondents didn't report, and only 30% actually reported. So this highlights that the current system isn't effective and that there needs to be additional processes incorporated where either 1, people feel more comfortable reporting, or 2, people can find other ways of responding that don't include reporting. So this could be found through community care and self-care, and it could also be found in having a more restorative justice approach. So this model is currently still in development, and it will be ready to go in the next few months. And more information and the contact details for the regional coordinators can be found at coalitionscreatingequity.ca. And since this model is only in Alberta, I want to highlight some other models that I know of. So 2 that I'm aware of are both in BC. So there is the Revelstoke Community Protocol to Address Hate and Bias-Based Incidents, and the Abbotsford Community Protocol, a response to critical incidents of discrimination and hate crime. So if you know of any other response models, please share them in the chat so that we can collect a list and distribute them afterwards. And these 2 mentioned response models are also in the handout that is associated with this webinar. So before we get into the actual responding, I think it's important to do a bit of reflection. And there are a couple of questions that I think are essential to go over before responding to online hate. And so please note that this is a very simple breakdown of this, and it's just meant to give you an idea of how to plan out a response. So this is the type of format that the CCE response model will have. And that one will be expanded to include all the protected grounds under the Alberta Human Rights Act, and also different paths to resolution depending on what type of incident occurred and what type of outcome the victim wants. So this diagram starts in the top right with the question, was there a criminal element? And so if there was a criminal element, the second question is, do you want to report to the police? If yes, then report to the police. And if no, report through another medium. So an example of that would be Stop Hate Alberta, which we're going to cover in more detail later on. And if there wasn't a criminal element, then reflect on whether or not you want to report the incident. If yes, then report it and proceed with the diagram. And if you don't want to report the situation, then do you want to resolve the situation? If no, then take some self-care time. It's important to take care of yourself after an incident happens to make sure that you can process everything and that you're feeling okay. And if yes, you want to resolve the situation, then the question is, do you currently have the capacity to engage? If no, then I encourage taking some time for self-care so that you can make sure that you're feeling well enough to engage with the situation. And if you do have the capacity, then the next question is, do you have the necessary information to respond? If you don't, then this is a good time to take some research, or sorry, to do some research. And if you do, then the question is, are you comfortable engaging directly or indirectly? And then respond in whatever way works for you. So, as is quite obvious, I think that one of the most important actions to take in responding is self-care. I mentioned this quote in the last webinar, and I also want to share it again because I think it is so important. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So this is a quote by Audre Lorde, and it is a quote that I base all of my community engagement and anti-racism on. It is important to make sure that people are well enough to engage in this type of work because it can be extremely exhausting. And so the intention of this activity is to reflect on what works for you. It isn't meant to be completely exhaustive, but it's rather meant to help you prepare for a response so that you don't get exhausted and overburdened. So this isn't easy work, and the way to make it somewhat more manageable is to know what we're good at, what we're capable of, and in which situations we can be the most effective.
As Tyra mentioned, we're now going to share a few resources on where you might report online hate. So as was provided as an example in the previous slide, Stop Hate Alberta. So this is a resource that people can access if they witness hate incidents in Alberta. So the quote provided on this slide comes directly from the website, and the purpose of Stop Hate Alberta is to fill the gap and create space to document. Using their online form, users can document hate incidents and can help build their real-time map of documented hate incidents in the province. Although this is specific to Alberta, if you are aware of a similar platform or service in your own province or territory, please comment in the chat box, and again, we can share them with participants. And so the next resource is your provincial or territorial human rights agency. Again, this is a good resource to access for up-to-date information, as well as if you do decide to file a human rights complaint. So for a full list of all the provincial and territorial human rights agencies, we have provided a link from the Canadian Human Rights Commission that lists all of them, but you will also receive this afterwards in the reference package. So building on what Tyra had talked about previously about actions to consider before responding, we're now going to look at a couple strategies that we've come up with for engaging with online hate. So we've tried to split this into both direct engagement and indirect engagement. So I'm going to start on the left with direct engagement. So in the particular situation, some actions you might take would be engaging in dialogue with the perpetrator. So this can be a strategy to use if there was a misunderstanding or if the person is open to understanding. It could also take the form of an offline conversation without the victim. And you do not necessarily need to have a relationship with the perpetrator to engage in effective dialogue. And finally, when engaging in dialogue with the perpetrator, it is also important to consider your own identity in this situation and take some time to reflect on if you have been emotionally impacted by this situation as well. Another strategy that you can take is to reach out to the person that has been impacted by the incident. You can also speak out without escalating the situation. You could take a strategy to diffuse the situation, and this could also involve redirection as one example. Or another direct engagement to take in the situation is being an effective witness. Some more actions you can take to prevent or reduce the likelihood of similar situations happening in the future is by participating in online campaigns, speaking out against hate in general, as well as donating to different organizations that promote anti-hate. And so moving on to the right, I'm now going to cover some of the indirect engagement strategies. So in this situation, you might consider unfollowing the person who posted the racist or xenophobic comment or image. You could boycott a business that shared a meme or something similar. You could also talk to a teacher or a person in your life with organizational power. An indirect engagement might be to report this. So that could be either to the police or through another method. A lot of social media sites actually have means through which you can report directly on their platform, and most will have information provided on the process to do so. And finally, in this situation, an indirect engagement might be ignoring. So it's important to note that ignoring can only work in some situations. For example, individuals who are trolling to get a reaction out of others, or a company releasing a racist ad to get media attention. This is a situation in which ignoring might be an effective approach. And finally, to prepare to respond later, some indirect actions that you could take would be to take self-care time and also to do further research. I would also like to share a quote from the Media Arts Report. So in this quote, they state that youth say they would be more likely to intervene or push back for reasons related to empathy, or if somebody they knew told them what happened hurt their feelings. If the platforms they use have clear rules and tools on how to report unacceptable behavior, and if there is consensus or if they thought that most people would agree with them. So this report and this quote is important in highlighting some of the factors that may influence people's willingness to push back against online hate. And these can be very complex. However, some actions that we can take or advocate for would be allowing for websites to have clear rules on how to report an instance on their website. So now we're going to revisit a resource that was shared in the first webinar on how you can respond to racism and xenophobia. So this is a 5-step response strategy that we have adapted from teachingtolerance.org. So the 5 different steps are to recognize, interrupt, question, educate, and echo. So we wanted to share this response strategy in this webinar as well, because it can be particularly helpful if you have witnessed racist or xenophobic comments online when there might be somebody you have a pre-existing relationship with, and then can engage in that face-to-face or virtual dialogue, or if the comment that you have witnessed happened through a virtual call or FaceTime. So the first step in recognizing is to, just like it sounds, recognize that the comments or media has a racist or xenophobic bias. And the second step is to interrupt. So interrupting shows the person that you're talking to is that what they've said is important enough to stop and address. And in these situations, it's also important to talk about the racism before you move on to anything else. So as you see in this diagram, we've provided some examples of what you might say to interrupt and then to question if what you are seeing potentially has an individual associating COVID-19 with a particular place or group of people. So the next step again is to question. So the goal of questioning is to get a better understanding of why the person said what they did. The goal of educating is to not just provide facts about a topic, but to explain to an individual about why what they have said needs rethinking. So this might involve understanding the history and harm of associating diseases with a specific place or group of people from a region in this example. And finally, echoing is an important step when somebody else speaks up on racist behaviors, is to emphasize or amplify their message in any way you can. So as I mentioned, we're going to revisit this resource again shortly and look at how we can adapt it to address some issues of online hate and hate speech. But the next thing we're going to move into is actually our second poll. So we'll be bringing up the poll shortly, but it's really just to get a sense of how many people have witnessed online hate and if you are likely to challenge this. So again, the first question is, have you seen any online hate related to COVID-19? All right, so it looks like 62% of respondents said yes, they have seen online hate related to COVID-19. So we hope some of the tools and resources that we're sharing can help you in deciding how or if you'd like to engage in that dialogue. And then 24% of respondents said no, they haven't seen any online hate related to COVID-19, and 14% said unsure. So again, we encourage you to think if you have seen online hate related to COVID-19, to think about these instances as we move into the next section. And again, if you responded with no or unsure, hopefully some of the resources and information we have shared may help in identifying those instances. So we're now going to bring up the second question, which is, how likely are you to challenge hate that you see online? So are you very likely, unlikely, or unsure? I'll give you a couple moments for that as well. Okay, so it looks like 33% said that they were unlikely to challenge hate you see online. 27% responded with likely, 24% unsure, and then 12% very likely, and 4% very unlikely. So again, we hope that some of the information that we are sharing can support you in challenging hate. Again, as Tyra had previously mentioned, sometimes this doesn't take the form of direct engagement, but there are steps that we can take collectively to help address hate online. But we understand that this is a challenging process, and we're going to go into a little bit more of the reasons on why you might consider responding or reporting later in the webinar. So thank you everyone for sharing. Okay, so now we're going to move into specific examples of online hate and discuss how we might respond to these using the 5-step response strategy I had shared previously. However, I want to warn people that the next slide is going to contain some racist images. So again, revisiting some of those guidelines if you need to take a step back. So. All right, so these are 2 examples that we have decided to share of some harmful memes online. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with the term, a meme is an amusing or interesting image or video that typically spreads widely online, especially through social media. So these ones are specifically related to COVID-19. Again, in our research, we have seen many examples of harmful and hateful memes on the internet. Entire threads dedicated to this type of content. However, we've decided to share these 2 examples because they focus both on associating the COVID-19 virus with a place or group of people. So on the left is a Photoshop character of Winnie the Pooh sitting in an armchair. So according to some sources, this was initially circulated as an image on 4chan in March of last year. And then this image gained widespread popularity on Reddit. So some websites, such as the one I'm quoting, are actually dedicated to tracking the origin and spread of these memes on the internet. And what is especially concerning is that on these similar websites, they actually contain templates that people can create their own posts that have the potential to spread widely across the internet. So especially if somebody is sharing hateful or false information, this can be really dangerous. And on the right, we have a image from the popular show The Office that has been widespread. And really, I wanted to highlight this one because it shows the link to pop culture TV shows and almost as the normalization of these comments and images. So next, we're going to use these examples to go through some of the response strategies. So moving on to that, and just consider the ways in which you might decide to respond to these if you had encountered that on the internet. So using this 5-step strategy, we have adapted this for a more simplified breakdown. So the first step, of course, is to recognize comments and posts that have a racist or xenophobic bias. And we hope that by you attending this webinar and this presentation, that it will help increase your awareness of these instances of online hate and how to recognize them. And the next step you might consider is if you want to engage directly or indirectly. So it's important here to remember to ask yourself some of these critical questions, such as, do you have the capacity to engage at this time? I've also included some examples of each. So for direct engagement, this might take the form of speaking out. And for indirect engagement, it could be simply unfollowing that individual. Next, you might want to ask your questions for yourselves, as in these situations, it may not be possible to question the perpetrator directly. So some questions we might ask ourselves to reflect would be, was there a criminal element? Or what more information do I need to effectively respond? And educate, again, is similar to what we had shared before. And this may involve, again, understanding the root cause of racism and xenophobia and the harm that it can cause, and helping to educate others. And finally, echoing or amplifying the messages. We wanted to prompt people to think about what this might look like online. So this may take the form of potentially participating in an online campaign, or maybe even retweeting somebody's message calling out online hate. So we wanted to leave you with, again, these strategies to help support you in identifying and addressing hate online. So next I'm going to move into some resources that we would like to share in reporting hate online and hate incidents. So Act 2, the ACT Foundation, which is Action Chinese Canadians Together, is working to highlight the equality and human rights impacts of COVID-19. So they actually now have a anti-racism incident reporting center, both through text and online. So the data collected will help identify trends, new and recurring, and will be used to help inform policy, service, and future anti-racism initiatives. So what's great is that this site is also available in multiple languages. So at the bottom there, you have the number that you can text to report, or if you go online, the screenshot on the right is actually what pops up if you do click report. And some other resources related to responding to online hate. So on the left, we have HateBase, which is a service built to help organizations and online communities detect, monitor, and analyze hate speech. So there has been issues related to online hate data. There is a limited amount of data pertaining to online hate in Canada. So resources such as HateBase will help get a clear picture of the issue, as well as increasing data on online hate instances. The Canadian Human Rights Commission is in the top right. So again, a resource if you are looking to file a complaint. And the Smart Cyber Security Network also has an online module on addressing online hate. That's part of a larger project with an organization called Project Someone. So I would definitely suggest visiting this resource if you are interested in learning more about online hate. It also has some great resources for youth as well. So now I'm going to hand things back to Tyra, who's going to talk a little bit more about why we might respond and report.
Thank you, Jayde. So we're going to start off with why respond. So this is a quote by Desmond Tutu, and it goes, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." So I think that this quote is a nice way to start off. Like the slide on why it's important to respond. So number one is it's important because you can show support for the person who is being impacted by the situation. And also because it shows people that these types of incidents aren't acceptable. And it also gives the opportunity to educate people. So this could be in a situation where someone maybe didn't realize the implications of what they said or what they shared. So this is a nice way to further educate so that that person won't like do the same thing again in situations where that's possible. And it's also really important because responding is like building a muscle. The more that you do it, the easier it becomes. And for the first time responding, it can be very stressful. Like it can make you nervous and afraid. But I think the more that you do it, the more natural it becomes. And so it's a lot easier to just step up in certain situations and respond once you kind of built the capacity to do it. And now, why report? So reporting is important for a couple of reasons. So number one is data tracking. So this can give awareness of like exactly what is going on and which groups are being impacted. And this can also help with analysis and finding ways to combat those hate because you know like where it's occurring or what groups are being impacted. And this also can help with funding because it shows the necessity for this type of work. And it's also important to report so that hate speech online can be reduced. So like for example, if you report a hateful tweet to Twitter, then hopefully they will remove it and then the impact of that will be mitigated. And it's also important to report because of personal importance. So this can help people feel connected with each other and also help build solidarity amongst people who are also experiencing hate incidences. And the final reason is so that we can hold people accountable. So this can help with changing mindsets. It can help with having the opportunity to have a teachable moment. And also to know who is perpetrating the hate incidences, because then people know who to stay away from in online spaces. And now, how do we incorporate boundaries into this? So a couple of ways are muting social media. So you can do this by muting certain words, setting time limits on when you will be able to be on social media and for how long. And also only interacting when you have the capacity to. And also thinking about how social media makes you feel. And if it makes you feel upset, if it makes you feel emotionally drained, then maybe it's a good idea to change the way that you're engaging with social media. And also let someone else take over. So this is specifically work related, but if one person is specifically tasked with giving updates on COVID-19 each week, that can be extremely emotionally taxing. So it's important to switch off the responsibility so that no one gets too overwhelmed, because right now everyone is oversaturated with traumatic and upsetting news. And the final way is to have a plan. So this is one for a self-care plan. So what to do if you're not feeling well, maybe have like a self-care kit ready for days where you're not feeling well, and also to have a response plan ready and know how you will respond if you see an incident online. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Jayde, who will cover some resources that we found for further learning.
Thanks, Tyra. So as we start to wrap up the webinar, we wanted to share some resources for further learning and to, again, opportunities to learn more about the topic if you were interested. So ones that we had mentioned previously, such as the Kids Help Phone, Hate Base, those are available on the handout. However, there is a resource I wanted to share just in our research on online hate and COVID-19. There is a massive open online course starting on May 4th, which is Monday. So this course is called From Hate to Hope, Building Understanding and Resilience. And I think is a great resource if you're interested in learning more on this topic. So the course is available in multiple languages, and full disclosure, we have not taken this course, but based on the description, again, it appears to be a great resource. So the objectives of the course are to explore the dynamics of hate, including some of its causes, strategies to build resilience to hate, discuss best practices to use social media for advocacy against hate speech, and analyzing and developing strategies to use on social media and in different sectors. Unfortunately, there's only so much we can cover in 2 hours, so we encourage you to visit some of these resources. I also want to mention that we'll be getting into the question portion of the webinar soon. So if you do have any questions you'd like to answer, or even some comments or resources that you know of, please feel free to start typing in the chat box and we'll get to them shortly. So another aspect that was mentioned earlier was online campaigns as a form of indirect engagement. So I just wanted to provide 2 examples. The first is Wash the Hate. So this is an example of an online campaign started to raise awareness of discrimination and xenophobia related to COVID-19. And below is the I Am Not a Virus campaign, which is another example of a campaign to raise awareness specifically of anti-Asian racism. So some of the benefits of online activism and campaigns is the reach. So widespread messages and engaging with audiences can be a great way to inform others of the issue. I know we've talked about some negatives in social media with respect to online hate and hate speech, but it can also be a powerful tool to spread positive messages and again, raise awareness. This can also help to motivate action, change perceptions of others, and during this time when we are all practicing social distancing, social media can be a great tool to connect with others around you. So I'll now pass things back to Tyra for our final poll.
Thanks, Jayde. So now we are having the final poll. So the second last question should show up on your screen shortly. So the question is, are you likely to use any of the resources that we shared? So it looks like 92% of respondents said yes, they're likely to use the resources, so that makes me personally happy. 7% said unsure, and then 1% said no. And now we're going to move into the final question. So this is, are you likely to take any of the actions that we recommended? And so for this one, 93% of respondents said that they're likely to take some of the actions that we recommended, whereas 7% are unsure. So this also makes me really happy, and I'm happy that we were able to coordinate this webinar on this topic. And so now to close before the question period, I would like to have us go through a self-care activity. So this is one that I personally do whenever I feel like I need some more grounding. So for this, I want everyone to start off with taking a couple of breaths. And then I want you to mentally or verbally name each of these categories. And if possible, try to add a little bit of detail to them. So for example, I have in front of me, I can see that I have a black laptop. So let's start off with 5 things that you can see. Four things that you can feel. Three things that you can hear. Two things that you can smell. And one thing that you can taste. So thank you everyone for participating in that. And also thank you for listening to us talk. So now we're going to move into the question period of this webinar. So if you haven't sent in any questions or comments yet, please go ahead and do that now.
All right, thank you, Jayde and Tyra. So yeah, as Tyra mentioned, we're just moving into the question period. So we've had a few questions come in throughout the course of this webinar. So I'm gonna start off. The first question was, what was the sample size for the coalition's Creating Equity response model?
Thank you. That's actually a good question. I should have mentioned that in the content. But the sample size for that was 128 responses for the survey, as well as the regional focus groups. So for me, I had 22 attendees in Calgary, and then the other coordinators also had their own focus groups.
Okay, perfect. Another question was, what BC resources are available in regards to human rights?
Thank you. So the ones that I know about are the Revelstoke Community Protocol to address hate and bias-based incidents. And then the second one is the Abbotsford Community Protocol, a response to critical incidents of discrimination and hate.
Awesome. Okay, can you both speak more to what ActionDignity and ARDN are doing in regards to online hate and anti-discrimination?
Sure. So in regards to what ARDN is doing with respect to online hate and anti-discrimination, again, this webinar is part of a larger project on anti-discrimination. So it has been great to better understand some of the complex issues related to anti-discrimination. However, our work is really focused in rural communities as well. So I think in the future, looking at ways in which we can support anti-discrimination practices in rural communities, and again, conduct more research on the complex nature of these issues in our smaller rural areas.
Yeah, and to add to that, like ActionDignity's kind of focus in any type of work is to add an ethnocultural lens. So I think with the COVID-19, it's just highlighted for me personally, like the lack of Canadian data on like hate incidences and also anything specifically related to like racism and xenophobia. So really the goal with ActionDignity's work in this is to kind of bring more awareness to this issue and also see how we can support people who are being impacted by this.
Great. So someone is wondering how they can know about the other AAISA webinars, which I can answer. They're all available at aisa.ca in the professional development page. And then a question for you, Jayde and Tyra. What will the next webinar in this series be about?
So the next webinar in this series is actually going to be about intersectionality and COVID-19. So again, we'll be building on the content in the COVID-19 and racism webinar as well as this one, but focusing on additional groups that weren't discussed. So we plan to use a intersectional lens to explore the ways in which oppression is amplified by COVID-19. And we'll also discuss ways in which people can encourage, I guess, a continued learning and engaging in mindful reflection. Tyra, do you have anything to add?
I think that basically covers it, but essentially, while we were creating the content for the first webinar, it was quite difficult to actually only keep it to the groups that we mentioned, because like oppression and inequity has been really amplified during this pandemic. So the next webinar is a chance to continue that analysis.
Yeah, and that webinar will be on Friday, May 15th, same time, same place. And the details are again all on AAISA's website. All right, so the next question we have is, do either of you have tips to deal with online hate when it comes from someone you know very well versus a stranger? For example, a Facebook post someone shares on their page.
Well, I think like it does vary a lot based on the relationship that you have with the person. Because I think having a relationship makes it, well, actually, it can make it easy and difficult in different ways. Like one, it's a lot easier to send a message to someone that you know because you already have that relationship, and so the likelihood of them responding is higher. But I think also if it is someone that you know who is saying remarks that you don't agree with, then that can also make it difficult to engage because it's like you kind of feel disappointed in them, or you could also feel personally impacted by the things that you say. So my tip that I usually use when I'm like calling in people that I know is to try to leverage the relationship that we have, and also to let them know that I'm not personally criticizing them, but rather I'm just concerned with some of the comments that they made. And usually I find that is like a helpful way to start the conversation, and also to not expect them to change immediately and to allow them a bit of time to understand what I'm saying to them.
I think that's a really great response, Tyra. I don't actually have a whole lot to add. I think you answered that really nicely.
Thanks, Jayde.
Perfect. So someone mentioned the Hate to Hope course. I think you mentioned it started on May 4th, but it looks like on the website it actually starts May 3rd. And there was a question, will AAISA recognize the 1 hour from the Hate to Hope online course? And so since this is a course offered by an external organization, AAISA would have to check to make sure the learning outcomes fit the settlement practitioner framework model. So if you're interested in trying to get credit for that, just email pd@aisa.ca and we can take it from there and look more into this course and see if it works. So another question was, how do organizations and companies counter online hate while trying to stay quote unquote professional on their social media platforms?
Well, I think that can be quite tricky. But I think like what I would say is the most like important element is just to be prepared, because like we know that online hate is happening, and we also know that like if organizations are sharing like specific posts related to anti-racism or any other topics, then it's likely that people will comment. So usually what I would do is I will like vet any posts that I make a lot of times just to make sure that no one can find any gaps. And also be prepared for contingency plans that I might have to take if people respond in like a harmful way. If it's like a genuine question, then I'm open to engaging with that. But if it's more of like an attack, then I might not engage and I might block them, or I might delete the comment, or I might send them a direct message instead so that the hate isn't happening like in view of everyone else that can be impacted by it.
And I think to add to what Tyra mentioned, again, being aware of the context and the various factors, I think organizations and companies may also experience trolling quite a bit as well. So understanding how your response to that might differ.
Awesome. So it looks like that's the end of questions, but we did have a couple of comments. There is on the Government of BC's website a page called Organizing Against Racism and Hate. And if you go there, it has all the services across BC that essentially are organizing against racism and hate. So we'll share this link in our post webinar email, which will also include a feedback survey for this webinar. Additionally, someone mentioned there is an online campaign, #Elima88. So I'll just spell it out, ELIMIN, the number 8, and then HATE. It provides an anonymous and safe reporting environment for Canadians of Asian ancestry experiencing anti-Asian attacks. So we'll also include this in our email. So yeah, that's the end of questions. Oh, and sorry, there was one that just came in. Do we get a certificate for this course? Not for this course on its own, but if you take all 3 of the webinars or watch the recordings of them, we can send you a quiz to complete to prove that you've learned all the learning outcomes, and then this will count as credit towards AAISA certification. Again, for more info, just email pd@aisa.ca.
So all of our contact information is on this page, including the PD email for AAISA if you have any questions regarding the certification. So if any other questions do come up, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us. And as we mentioned, this webinar is part of a larger anti-discrimination webinar series and workshops. So as Raeesa mentioned, please visit the professional development page on AAISA's website to get more information on upcoming dates and registration. And we just want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day today to attend the webinar, and thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. And also, I just want to let everyone know that the PowerPoint will be sent out. And also this recording of this webinar will also be available on the AAISA YouTube channel.
Perfect. Thank you, Jayde and Tyra, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As they mentioned, we will be sending out an email to all the participants with the presentation attached, the recording, and any of the resources we mentioned. And please do fill out the survey, as it really helps us create these webinars so they are made, for you and what you want to learn. Again, the next webinar will be on Friday, May 15th at the same time. The webinar link is on aisa.ca in the PD page, so please go sign up there, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.